To understand a dialect, you need to understand its history. So how did English in the Upper Peninsula emerge and develop the way we recognize it today as Yooper talk? How is that idea of sounding like a Yooper tied to being a Yooper? English in the Upper Peninsula is relatively new compared to other varieties of American English. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that English speakers visited the area and settled here. There are 4 major factors that have affected the development of English in the Upper Peninsula the way it is. Geography, the area's isolation. Historical events, such as immigration and settlement patterns. The people who moved here, the people who have lived here, like the Anishinaabe. The languages that came into contact over time, including varieties of American English, especially from the East Coast and the Midwest. Also Cornish English and Irish English. French Canadian, or Canadian French. Economics are also a factor that affect the dialect, mining and tourism in particular. And then our language attitudes, what we think of as good and bad English, or do we have those values about what it means to sound like a Yooper? I'm assuming that all of you know what a Yooper is, but just in case you don't, here's a definition from the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary. It got in the dictionary in 2014 after a 12-year solicitation by Steve Parks, who was playing Scrabble with a friend in 2002 in Nobbinway, Michigan. And he wanted to use the word Yooper. And if you play Scrabble, you know that Y is worth a lot of points. But his friend said, no, that word is not in any dictionary. So Steve Parks started soliciting Merriam-Webster's, and it finally got in 2014. You can find it between your and yoo-hoo. Now, the emergence of the word Yooper is also relatively recent. It wasn't until 1970s that we see it come into print. But keep in mind, for a word to become into print, it has to first exist in spoken language. Spoken language is primary to written language. You can see here, in 1975, we have the first written evidence of it. And maybe it was written somewhere else before that, but this was the first one that we've been able to find. What's interesting to me about this timeline isn't just the fact that it shows when Yooper became existed in written language, but also the language attitudes that get reflected here and the attitudes about what it means to be a Yooper. Not everybody has a positive attitude about what it means to be a Yooper. And you can see this in 1982. Sociologist Michael Luukkonen, that you might know here at Northern Michigan University, created a documentary about the local culture, and he wanted to call it Yoopers. But there was a lot of resistance from the local community, especially older residents, because there are negative connotations associated with the term Yooper and the lifestyle of a Yooper. So he changed the name of the film to Good Man in the Woods. The last 2 examples are also particularly interesting to me because it shows that somewhere in the 80s, there was an emergence of a connection between what it means to be a Yooper and what it means to sound like a Yooper. We didn't see this before. And you saw, so with Say Ya to the UPA from Jack Bowers, also of Marquette's bumper sticker. And then in 1986, the band that you might know as the Yoopers, they originally were called the Yoopers. So we see here dialect features getting connected with not just the place, but a certain way of being, what it means to be a Yooper. So how did the dialect emerge? Well, I had mentioned immigration and settlement patterns, the languages that people spoke when they moved here, and those contact among those languages. Evidence in contact is in place names. For example, Lake Superior, even though those words are English words, it shows a French connection. French has a noun first, lake, and then adjectives follow the noun. In English, we do the opposite. We put the adjective before the noun. Presque Isle, here in Marquette, that's a borrowing from French, too. You can also see it in local place names that have Anishinaabemuan background. So Nobbinway, that I had mentioned, Negaunee, Munising. Munising means by the big island, and there's Grand Island out there, and Keweenaw, which means portage or passageway. Many of the place names are actually translations into English from Anishinaabemowan. For example, Portage Lake in Houghton County means Keweenaw because of portage or passageway. This sign, Kausit Lats, is a really good example of Finnish contact with English. Now, the sign was created in the 1980s by a local resident who lived down this road, and you can see in the background the official name of the sign, or the street, excuse me. And this street has historical as well as sociolinguistic relevance, the name does. In the background, you can kind of see Quincy Mine Hoist. Down this street was, at one time, a mining community, company housing. From 1845 to 1945, that mine was in operation, and miners and families lived down this road. Many of the families had their own cow. They kept it in a single-stall cowshed or a little barn, and somebody would walk that cow to the flats or the pasture during the day. Now, that's the historical part. The linguistic part is this is a really good example, like I said, of Finnish contact. Finnish alphabet doesn't use the letter C. It uses a letter K for any K sound. In English, we have the K, we have the CK, and there's some other combinations. When Finnish speakers speak English as a second language, Finnish doesn't have the sh, the SH sound, so they often pronounce S. Remember I told you that this was a pasture land for cows? Okay, you got that first part, right? Now, what about the flats part? Well, flats was what the pasture was called, but Finnish doesn't allow for two consonants or a consonant cluster of f and ul to begin the word, so many speakers would drop the f and just say lats. So you get it, cow shit flats. And that's the official name of the street. Now, so what is a dialect? I'll give you an analogy with a pie. Language is like a pie, any kind of pie, generic pie. Dialects are like variations on that pie theme, blueberry, cherry, even a tart. Dialects vary because of the sounds or the phonology, the morphology or how words are put together, the lexicon or vocabulary, including syntax or what we might think of as grammar. All of those features of language will vary to make a dialect, and what we will identify as distinct dialects, but they're enough alike that they are part of that main language or that pie. One example locally, of course, of phonological variation is sauna. Most people in the Upper Peninsula will say sauna, but believe it or not, most other Americans will say sauna. Another local example would be the word pasty, you know, the handheld meat pie crusted thing with sometimes rutabagas. And some people will say pasty, and others might have the sound, pasty, pasty, pasty. Other dialect features that aren't necessarily part of the UP but other regions might be greasy versus greasy, or coupon versus coupon. These pronunciations are also a really good example of language contact. They show that settlers mixed and mingled. And in fact, in the UP, at one time, late 1800s to early 1900s, there were more people here that spoke other languages than that spoke English. And in fact, the Calumet schools have records that show in the early 1900s, they had students from 40 different nationalities. You can imagine that they spoke at least half as many languages. When those people were learning English, they typically learned it from other people who spoke English as a second language. So what happened here was we have an accented English that developed over time. Now, in addition to pronunciation, another example of dialect variation and how language contact affects that is the effects on vocabulary or the lexicon. Some of these you might be familiar with. For example, use or chook. How many wore a chook today? Any of you wore a chook? I see a chook out there. Now, some of these words, though, are not what people might think of as the dialect. They fly under the radar. For example, make wood. I've never seen a bumper sticker or a t-shirt that says, I make wood. Or I've never seen a hat that says, I like bakery. Bakery is a particularly interesting example because it's one of those words that's part of the dialect, yet people don't recognize it as iconic of the dialect. This is a sign from Covington Music Festival, and it says, all bakery fresh from Lowry's pasty shop. They are talking about the baked goods themselves, not the building. Another way that dialects vary is according to semantics or meanings that words have. Here's bakery as a really good example. The building where baked goods are made and the baked goods themselves. Bakery is also a really good example of language contact. We find this use of bakery as the baked goods in other places where Germans settled. Milwaukee, for example, and other parts of Wisconsin. Now, pank. This is a word that many Yoopers claim to be their own, and it's only in the UP. I have evidence from the Dictionary of American Regional English, however, that it's not, I'm sorry to say. It's also found in Pennsylvania and upstate New York. Now, what those three areas have in common, they're mining regions. Also, the other thing they have in common is that Norwegians, Danes, Swedes settled in those areas. So we're not quite sure where the word came from. You can see that perhaps. Maybe it's a blend or a coming together of pack and spank. But notice how those three languages have a similar word, bunka. And those languages, instead of having what we might consider a strong B sound, often use more sound like a P sound. So that is a plausible reason. You can also see here that the different definitions and evidence from northern Michigan, and that means the UP. In addition to phonology, the sound system, word meanings, and vocabulary or the lexicon, there's also grammatical variation that makes a dialect a dialect. Now, oftentimes people will see these or hear these, probably not see them, most people don't write them, you would hear them, and people recognize them as local ways of speaking, but often they think they're ungrammatical, bad English, that's improper. But this is what makes the dialect distinct. And again, it's based on language contact. Finnish doesn't have prepositions or articles. And the majority of people who settled in the northwestern part of the Upper Peninsula spoke Finnish. And when those languages came into contact, Finnish and English in particular, those rules for Finnish transferred onto English. People still understand what you mean if you say, I go shopko or I went post office. We don't really need those prepositions and articles. There's nothing wrong about it. It's just different. It's not ungrammatical. It's not bad English. As with any dialect, the unique sounds, words, and grammatical structures are what make a dialect a dialect. And these are some of the things that make UP English Yooper talk. As we've seen, history, social interaction resulting in language contact are the key ingredients that make a dialect a dialect. We've also seen that language attitudes are a part of that. And our attitudes about dialects and perceptions about dialect speakers, and I should say that we all have a dialect no matter what, even your high school English teacher had a dialect. So whatever our attitudes and perceptions are, we have to remember that dialects are our badge of identity. They are who we are. It represents where we're from, our families, our communities, our values, our genders, our ages. And if we remember that, we can also remember that for some people, what it means to be a Yooper means to be proud, tough, and independent, especially from a place that's rooted in hard labor and has a climate that's sometimes really hard to live in with snow at least 6 months out of the year. So what makes a dialect a dialect? We do. As we shape our history, as we interact with each other, as we post memes on social media about dialects or dialect speakers, as we have conversations with friends and coworkers and family members. My hope is that by understanding the history of the dialect and understanding the distinct features that make it, and that all those features aren't necessarily distinct to the UP, we can come appreciate a dialect, Yooper talk, and what it means. Thank you.